So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining. We're all really excited to have you here with us today. So today's webinar will be discussing the launch of the research report between the Grantham Research Institute, Shade UK, and Love Design Studio. The project focuses on tackling overheating in buildings with a specific focus on the London Borough of Islington, and developing a new index for buildings to inform buyers and tenants of overheating risk within their home and their workplace. So I'm just going to go through the agenda for today. So we'll start off with some introducing the speakers that we have. And then we're going to hand it over to Grantham Institute to talk about the project background, and then we'll hand it over to Love Design Studio and Shade UK team to talk about the key findings from the research report. And then we'll finish off by talking about the next steps, and then we're going to open a Q&A up for the audience. So feel free to post any questions that you have throughout the webinar into the Q&A box, and then we'll answer them all at the end. So yeah, we've got a really great panel for you all today. As this project is a collaboration, again, between the Grantham Research Institute, Shade UK, and Love Design Studio. So from the Grantham team, we have Dr. Candice Howarth, who's the Head of Climate Adaptation and Resilience. And we've got Anna Beswick, who is a Climate Adaptation and Resilience Lead at Grantham. And then from the Shade UK and Love Design Studio team, we have Andy Love, who's the Managing Director at Shade UK and Love Design Studio, and Penny Phillipson, who's a Sustainability Consultant at Love Design Studio. And finally, we have me, Shreya Kapoor, who will be chairing the webinar today, and I'll also be presenting some of the findings from the report. So I'm going to hand it over to Candice very quickly to introduce Grantham.
Great, thanks ever so much, Shreya. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So as Shreya mentioned, my name is Candice Howarth. I'm the Head of Climate Adaptation and Resilience at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. We're based at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and we've been in place since about 2008. And we conduct policy relevant research around climate change, and the work that I've been leading around adaptation has covered a range of different issues, but specifically around heat. We've really picked up this work in the last 2 or 3 years, which really initiated with an analysis of what happened during the 2022 summer heat waves. And off the back of that, we've been involved in a range of different policy relevant projects that are seeking to engage with audiences and stakeholders across different sectors who have an interest in better preparing and better managing the impacts of heat across the whole of the UK, with the aim of producing resilient approaches that safeguard those who are most vulnerable in society and those who become vulnerable during periods of extreme heat. So it's been a real privilege to work with Love Design Studio and Shade the UK on this really important work. Thank you.
Thanks, Candice. I'm going to now hand over to Andy to introduce Shade UK and Love Design Studio.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, Candice. And it's a pleasure to have worked on this project with such a brilliant cohort of people and with different backgrounds. So just an introduction to Shade the UK for those who don't know. We started Shade the UK when it was all about raising awareness of the issues of climate change and how it impacts vulnerable people specifically. And now we're all about adapting the built environment and public spaces to protect the vulnerable against the changing climate. The reason for setting up Shade the UK was mainly brought about by my experience as a sustainability consultant for a number of years, over a decade, and found that primarily there's an issue where there's lack of awareness around overheating risk, especially in the built environment industry. There's lack of practice, so buildings are being designed without thinking about thermal comfort in mind, and lots of those buildings have been constructed. And then thirdly, there's such great work that's been happening in the research world that we're looking to try and make sure that it's implemented ASAP. So it's kind of joining the 3 circles of the Venn diagram there, being a champion for all 3 sectors. Next, Shreya. And this is our theory of change. So this is what we are now posing as our mission. So our overall mission, off the back of things like understanding the July 2022 heat wave, where there were in excess of 3,000 deaths during that period from from overheating per se. But the primary mission is to have 0 deaths from overheating in the UK and to make sure the health and well-being of vulnerable people is safeguarded during hot weather. And everything that we do at Shade UK is focused around this. So that means that we collaborate with lots of different organisations, including Love Design Studio, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Next row. So Love Design Studio is a sustainability consultancy that I founded, which works across a broader range of sustainability services, including overheating, energy, retrofit, and is the sister company of Shade UK, which helps support the running of Shade UK and also supports on certain projects and services related to a lot more about building performance and some of the stuff that we'll talk about today.
Great, so I'm now going to pass it over to Candice to discuss the project background.
Great, thanks so much, Shreya. So to give you all a bit of context to the work that we've been doing in collaboration with Shade the UK, as many of you may know, but many of you may not remember, 2022 was the warmest year on record for the UK, where we saw temperatures peaking at over 40 degrees for the first time ever. 2023 was the warmest year on record globally, and we're waiting to see, but it looks like 2024 is set to break that record and will be the warmest year on record, above 2023. So what we're seeing in terms of heat globally, but particularly across the UK, is that adaptation to this type of climate risk is just insufficient. With what we're seeing with heat, we're going to start seeing these types of events that we experienced back in 2022. They're going to be becoming more frequent, more pronounced, more complex, and more difficult to manage. And those who are most vulnerable across society are going to suffer the most. One of the problems with extreme heat is that this is an invisible risk. It's a silent risk, but it is rising in its intensity, its frequency, and its duration. So it really needs to be taken seriously so that we don't see a repeat of the number of heat-related deaths we experienced back in 2022. We've been looking at this for a number of years now. And if I move on to the next slide, we have an animation that we'd like to share with you. Hopefully this will work, but if it doesn't, we have a backup.
In summer 2022, temperatures in England reached over 40 degrees Celsius. Almost 3,000 people died from the heat, and a national emergency was declared. Older people, people with health conditions, the young, and people directly exposed to heat, such as homeless people and outdoor workers, are most at risk. Extreme heat can impact the economy and productivity. It can lead to reduced performance of buildings and infrastructure. Trains can be delayed by lower speed limits to prevent buckling or the expansion of overhead cables. Performance of workers can be impaired in overheated workplaces. Extreme heat impacts food security by damaging crops, harming livestock, and destroying natural habitats. Extreme heat raises the risks of other impacts. For instance, if extreme heat occurs when it's extremely dry, this can increase the danger of wildfires. The impacts of heat can also be felt at lower temperatures than those experienced during extreme heat waves. Acting now, rather than trying to cope when heat waves happen, will save lives, protect nature, and reduce costs. Designing towns, cities, buildings, and infrastructure to be resilient to hot temperatures is vital. Protecting nature and creating space for more trees and natural spaces will help nature to cope and keep us cool. Government is failing to act. Opportunities are being missed to increase resilience. Under a changing climate, heat waves will become more severe, more frequent, and last longer. Without adaptation, heat-related deaths will increase. Urgent action is needed now.
Great, thanks very much for that. So as you can see, we've been trying in a creative way to try and put across quite a dire message around the importance of tackling extreme heat. And that was very much based on the 2022 heat waves. So if I could have the next slide, please, Shreya. Great, thank you. So as a bit of a recap, I mean, it's important to remember that summer 2022 was 2.5 years ago. We've not had particularly exceptionally hot summers since. So as a bit of a reminder, during that summer, we actually had 5 heat periods that ran from mid-June until the end of August. And it was on the 19th of July that we saw those temperatures reach over 40 degrees. This was in England, and it led to the first level 4 heat health warning by the Met Office. But we did also see other temperature records broken across Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And some of those temperature records were also experienced at night. So the body doesn't have the ability to cool down over a natural 24-hour cycle. So we saw close to 3,000 heat-related deaths recorded that summer. And it's important to note that when it comes to heat, most of those deaths are avoidable. And this was actually the highest excess mortality figure that we saw as a result of heat since the 2004 heatwave plan for England, which was put in place in 2004. And that plan was put in place the year after we saw the devastating 2003 European heat waves that saw tens of thousands of deaths. So ever since that time, we hadn't reached that number of heat-related deaths. Next slide, please. So in addition to what I've just said, why is this important? We know that the heat back in summer 2022 was made 10 times more likely because of climate change. And from what we know around the projections and predictions around climate change in the near future and the longer term, this is likely to become more frequent. So we're going to be seeing these types of extreme high temperatures, those 40-degree temperatures will become more frequent, but we'll still see temperatures above 30, above 35, at which people who are most vulnerable tend to be seriously affected. We know that the heat affects both physical and mental health. It's important to combine those two and to really have considerations around the way in which heat affects people's behavior, people's mental health, but also the way in which it affects people's medication that they might be taking for mental health reasons. It affects our buildings and our infrastructure, it affects people, it affects the economy, and it affects nature. So it really affects all aspects of our lives and society. And what's also important to say is, because we're talking here a lot about extreme heat, but extreme heat is very contextual as well. It's very subjective. And we have seen heat-related deaths, or there is evidence to suggest that heat-related deaths can be attributed to moderate outdoor temperatures. So temperatures as mild as 25 degrees in certain built environment settings that are not adequate or not sufficiently designed to cope with those types of temperatures, we can start seeing excessive heat scenarios within those settings. And often they tend to house those most vulnerable within society. Next slide, please. So we did some research the last few years, and we published this report earlier this year, where we looked at what happened during the 2022 summer heat waves in England, and we looked at the way in which that could inform our approaches for the UK as a whole. And quite worryingly, what we found from our analysis of people who were working on the ground during those heat events, that the UK isn't prepared, and the processes that are in place are not adequate, and that they're stretching people across different sectors, across different organisations to their max. And the real sense that we got, particularly speaking to emergency responders, whether it was the fire brigade, the ambulance service, local authorities, water companies, energy companies, we got a real sense that they were very close to a breaking point when it came to that one day where we experienced 40 degrees. So if you cast your mind back to 2020 to 2023, across Europe, actually, we saw 40 degrees and plus temperatures over consecutive weeks on the continent. Had we experienced that in the UK, we would have been in real trouble. So that work that we're doing is we're calling for a national heat risk strategy to really address the scattered approach that we have in the UK. And I won't go into much detail about this particular diagram, but it's really to show that heat risk in the UK needs to fall under climate adaptation, but it also needs to fall within the climate mitigation sphere. We don't want to be encouraging where it's not appropriate for example, the use of energy intensive technologies when this isn't necessarily needed, where perhaps behavior change and nature-based solutions can help supplement and can help people stay cool and comfortable during periods of extreme heat. And within that, we really need to be focusing on the most vulnerable across society that you heard of in the animation earlier. But it's also important to bear in mind that during periods of extreme heat, anyone can become very vulnerable very, very quickly. The heat affects our body in a way that UK society isn't as used to as we would like to think. So we need this whole society approach. We need to be thinking about the built environment and the regulation and benchmarks that are required. And this is very much where this work with Shade the UK has come from. Next slide, please. Now we're focusing on London for this particular project. And one of the reasons is that London is getting hotter. And this is as a result anyway of the urban heat island effect, where you see temperatures in urban environments often 5 to 6 degrees warmer than peri-urban or rural areas. Back in 2022, we saw just under 350 heat-related deaths that summer. Heat affects those who are most vulnerable, we know that, and that we see the heat risk in London tends to be concentrated more towards the centre. And so work that came out of the London Climate Resilience Review and some of the work that we've done and Shade the UK have done has really highlighted the need for a combination of approaches, where we look at behaviour and culture, where we look at nature-based and institutional approaches, and that we tackle our infrastructure to make sure that those who reside or have to use infrastructure are better prepared. Next slide, please. And so we're focusing even more specifically, we're looking at Islington for a variety of reasons. Now, Islington as a borough is one of those most at risk of overheating. We see higher densities of different types of properties that are more prone to overheating. And this could be because of their age, because of their condition, because of their use, because of the fabric that is used to build them. And we will come to that in presenting some of the findings in a moment. We see some of the higher ambient temperatures that are due to the variability of the urban heat island effect. And we also see those local ambient temperatures increasing because of that use of energy intensive technologies where it isn't necessarily necessary. I do say that with a caveat though, that we want to emphasize the fact that certain settings such as care settings and hospitals where energy intensive technologies is almost a non-negotiable. So there are some complexities around making those choices of what is an appropriate way in which to manage and prepare for heat. So in the work that we've been doing in Islington, we've been focusing on specific settings where we know vulnerable individuals reside. So we've been looking at schools, hospitals, care homes, and residential settings. And from the maps that you can see on the right, it's a little bit unclear, but just to give you a sense of why those maps are there, is they really highlight why Islington as a borough is most vulnerable, and those settings are particularly prone to overheating. The next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and just to give you another reason as to why we're focusing on Islington, I've been mentioning nature-based solutions, and green spaces play a really important role in enabling people and buildings to cool down during periods of heat. But actually Islington only has 10% of publicly accessible green spaces, which is actually making it the second lowest among all 32 London boroughs. So this is a real problem for the borough, and this is why this research has been looking at the buildings within the borough, those particular settings, to get a sense of their exposure to heat and the way in which that could be affecting those who reside or occupy them. Next slide, please. And so finally, just to give you a sense of how the project has been broken down, it's been quite a short project, but we've managed to achieve a lot within it. Huge credit to the Shade the UK team. So we conducted an overheating assessment earlier on in the project. And alongside that, we started conducting a review of existing metrics and technologies. We really wanted to get a sense of, well, what are some of the tools that are already out there or that could be applied within the context of heat to start providing guidance and advice and communicating more clearly what are the risks, what are the impacts of heat in certain settings, and in a way that is tangible so people actually know, those occupants or those building managers actually know what to do in order to increase the preparedness and resilience of people who are residing within those buildings. And then alongside that as well, we had an in-depth stakeholder engagement process, and we also collected a set of narratives. And the reason behind that is because we can have all the quantitative data that we need. We seem to have those figures around heat-related deaths that happened back in 2022, but it doesn't seem to be having the impact that we require the most. So the narratives are a really powerful way to collect stories of people's experiences of heat that can't be captured adequately within data and stats. So that set of narratives that we'll come to in a moment as well is a really useful tool to really help connect people and engage the human dimension and the human way in which people are affected by heat. We're going to be publishing the final report in the very near future, but as part of this process, and this webinar forms part of that process, is we really want to consult with the public and with stakeholders who are engaged in this space so we can make sure we're getting this right and it's landing on those desks and it's landing with those stakeholders who can have the most in influencing and taking up some of the findings. So I will leave it there and hand back over to Shreya and Andy.
Thank you, Candice. That was really great. I'm now going to pass it over to Tony from Love Design Studio to start talking about the key findings from our research report.
Thank you, Shreya. So once we'd made the decision to focus the technical assessment on the borough of Islington, our first task was to review the building stock in the area and carry out an archetyping exercise. We started by mapping the indices of multiple deprivation, as shown here, across the borough of Islington to determine those areas most likely to have a higher population of vulnerable people. The IMD dataset covers 7 different domains of deprivation, including health, education, employment, and income. Zoning in on the areas of highest deprivation, we searched for suitable examples of buildings listed on this slide here across residential and commercial building types to check whether we could find examples to base our detailed thermal modelling analysis work on. And this was to ensure that we captured a different set of buildings and allow comparison of those with each other for buildings that would typically be used and residing by those vulnerable people. Where it wasn't possible to find the suitable buildings within those, the first upper decile for the IMD, we then searched into the next lowest. So as you can see here on the image, the pink are the primary areas that we searched in, and then we moved down the scale. We then developed a dynamic simulation model for each of these to allow us to carry out that technical analysis for the overheating assessment. Next slide, please. So looking at the first building type in the list, we have the high-rise residential. So we can see here that some of the typical features of these buildings can lead to quite severe issues with overheating. We often have single aspect rooms, quite high portions of glazing, which leads to excessive solar gains. And there can also be security and noise concerns around being able to open those windows for natural ventilation, particularly at the lower floors. Our modelling across the different building types tested a range of different scenarios. The 2 key sets that we're presenting some summary results for today are the ones run with the CIBC DSY1 2020 50th percentile weather file, and compared with a marked increase in those ambient temperatures for the 2080 DSY2 90th percentile weather file. You can see here the numbers towards the bottom right of the page here, that peak temperatures, even with the 2020s weather file, can reach into those mid-30s and exceed the comfortable occupant thermal temperature of 26 degrees C for over 500 hours. And there's a marked increase in the likely temperatures, peak temperatures and hours of exceedance as we go to those hotter, much hotter ambient conditions there, potentially getting up to 50 degrees C without any mitigation. Next slide. Similarly, for low-rise residential, there are, again, similar risks around solar gains and high temperatures affecting thermal comfort of occupants. One slight benefit that the low-rise residential properties tend to have over the high-rise is that they're more likely to have dual aspect to aid that natural ventilation, and that's reflected in some of the slightly lower peak temperatures that we found in our analysis here. One point to note here is that the west-facing bedrooms can be a particular high-risk area as the heat builds up in the evening and can then make it very difficult to have comfortable sleep, which obviously has knock-on impacts to overall health. Next slide, please, Shreya. Another key building type is hospital, and for quite obvious reasons here, we've got a lot of people with health conditions and vulnerable population using a hospital, and we, in a change to the standard method that we applied to the other building types and following on to what Candice mentioned about certain buildings having a non-negotiable need for cooling systems, we also tested how the cooling load and the annual energy consumption for those cooling systems would be impacted by a warmer climate and higher indoor temperatures. We can see here that we've got potentially quite a lot of overcrowding within the hospital areas and the patient rooms, and the potential temperatures are quite scary without the cooling system working there into the 40s for the 2020s weather file and up to potentially 50 degrees C for the warm weather. We see here also a marked increase up to around 50% increase in the cooling capacity, and that's going to mean that systems are not going to be adequate to maintain those comfortable temperatures, which would need a lot of investment to upgrade those systems in due course. Next slide, please, Shreya. Another important type when we're considering building type, when we're considering vulnerable people, is a care home. So we see here again some of the key risk factors that we have people that are unable to perhaps voice their concerns or take evasive action when indoor temperatures are excessively high. And we found that those lounge areas where patients and residents will be spending a lot of their time are the areas where you will see those higher temperatures, potentially have old ventilation systems that are not able to adequately remove that heat buildup during those warmer conditions. And again, we see those temperatures creeping into the mid-30s as a peak temperature for the 2020s weather file, and into the 40s for the 2080s weather file, with quite a marked increase in the hours above that 26 degrees C threshold as well. Next slide, please. We also wanted to consider prison buildings. You can see from the image on the right here that there are certain features of those buildings which are not well set up or are geared towards removal of heat, limited ventilation options, overcrowding, and extended time indoors with quite a compact layout of rooms within the building. We can see again that the peak temperatures that result from our analysis, or the indicative temperatures, are straying into the mid-30s, which is already very, very uncomfortable for the 2020s, and then up to mid-40s as we look at those warmer conditions. And the final building type that we're presenting results for here, and we concluded in our assessment, was primary schools. Again, we can see that there's certain features of the building which can lead to quite high gains. We've got the high solar gains due to high proportions of glazing, high internal gains due to high population or high occupancy densities, lighting and equipment within those rooms. And all the while noting that children can be particularly vulnerable to the effects of those high temperatures, and clearly has a knock-on impact on their capacity for learning. We see here that I think the thing that stands out is the hours of exceedance of that 26 degrees C threshold, potentially going up by 4-fold based on the analysis that we've been able to carry out.
Thank you, Tony. That was great. So for the next part, I'll be sharing the key findings from the interviews that we did with Islington residents. So as Candice covered earlier, an essential part of the project was collecting anecdotal evidence via interviews with Islington residents and people who work in Islington as well, who shared their experience with overheating within the buildings that they live and that they work in. So the stories shared were able to provide like kind of a non-technical insights to how buildings are performing under high temperature scenarios, and how the vulnerability of these individuals differ within these buildings as well. So here are a select few stories from some of the interviews that we did with the Islington residents. So first we have Pamela, who is a former paediatric nurse, and she shared her experience working in a children's ward during the heat wave. And you know, hospital patients, especially children, are extremely vulnerable to heat as it can exacerbate their existing health conditions. It's also important to note that heat mortality figures, when it comes to heat waves, the number is expected to be a lot higher than what is actually reported, because heat doesn't always directly harm or kill people in a heat wave. For example, Pamela explained how the drugs that were practically ineffective during a heat wave, once they left that drug room that has air conditioning, and as a consequence, or any consequences to this, wouldn't necessarily be reported as a heat-related injury or a heat-related death. We also interviewed a guy named Joseph, who works for the London Tenants Federation, and he shared his experience working with tenants and housing associations during the 40-degree heat wave. And as a high proportion of the tenants that he worked with were elderly, he kind of expressed how there was little to no support for them during heat waves. We also interviewed Tabitha, who is a former primary school teacher who shared her experience teaching during the 40-degree heatwave in 2022. Many schools across London closed or closed early during that heatwave period, but hers stayed open. So she expressed how there was practically no learning done during those 2 days, and the children became restless, no one could concentrate, and some even expressed how they were afraid, as they had never experienced something like this before. Tabitha also lives in a former council home in Islington, and she shared her experience with overheating within her home, especially within her living room, which is south-facing, and she expressed how unbearable it was during that 40-degree heat wave. And we also talked to Johnny. So it's not just people, but businesses and the economy that can be extremely impacted by heat waves and overheating within buildings. So yeah, this is Johnny from the Pleasance Theatre in Islington, and he talked to us about how ticket sales and audience numbers are extremely low during heatwave periods. So if businesses are unable to adapt their buildings to accommodate people during hot weather, then staying open will become increasingly difficult, especially as climate change worsens. We've got a lot more stories and people that we interviewed that are also shared within our report, but those were just a select few. Another key part of the project was holding a roundtable event with key stakeholders who live and work in Islington. So that included local architects, some members of Islington Council, some residents, some members of the GLA, and Housing Association representatives as well. This roundtable was kind of a interactive workshop style event, which focused on a new overheating metric, and what it could look like and how it may benefit them. So that's the end of that. So I'm now going to pass it over to Andy, who's going to discuss more detail about our research into existing heat metrics.
Thank you, Shreya. So all the work that was carried out before was in anticipation and to support the actual output that we're looking for, which is to understand if there is a particular heat metric or certificate or index that could be provided for buildings that demonstrates the resilience or lack of resilience to overheating risk. For instance, we looked at existing metrics that already work or work well or don't work as well. For instance, the food hygiene rating index metric that we see often slapped on the front door of a restaurant or cafe. It's gone through some bad press recently, actually, but what we thought here was that it was quite a simple method for showing whether a building or a shop or restaurant performs to a certain standard. We looked at other measures that are more in the built environment industry, for instance, the certification schemes around sustainability. We also looked at UV index and BREEAM ratings, again, very much related to the built environment industry. I think a common theme across most indexes and metrics is that people opt for a color scheme. They find that quite useful. And also a common approach, which was to try and disaggregate data in a simple way. And often some of that information is quite complex behind the metric. And I guess a conundrum for what we're trying to think about with buildings, it's quite a complex, nuanced thing, overheating in buildings, and how do we communicate that in a way that anyone can understand? Next, right? So actually what inspired this type of work off the back of the ongoing work that Shade UK have been doing with LSC in the background is the Energy Performance Certificate. And for those who are unaware, the EPC is a mandatory certificate that is required when you sell a building or lease a building, and it demonstrates a performance, an energy rating performance, and is often linked with the actual costs of the running costs of the building as well. So it's not just as simple as carbon emissions associated to a building, it's a little bit more complex than that. However, we use this as the kind of baseline approach of can we do something similar to what the EPC does in a way that means that when a building is sold or leased, it can or has to demonstrate whether that particular building is resilient to overheating risk or performs well. And the reason being that we think that if a landlord or a homeowner is given the stick rather than the carrot and pushed to show what the performance of a building is when it comes to overheating risk, they may look to retrofit their building or enhance the performance of their building before they sell or lease that particular building. And that could be an office building, could be a residential home, it could be any type of building, public or non-public. Extra. As part of the research that we did, more traditional research, we looked into what is happening across the globe, internationally, in Europe and the UK. And for those who are in this audience who are sustainability consultants or do overheating assessments, some of this will be familiar to you, whereas others it will be less familiar. Internationally, you have certain standards and methodologies for understanding overheating risk, such as the Part O building regulations, CIBSE TM50 and TM59, as well as other ISOs and ASHRAE standards. Whereas locally, we have certain UK-bound technologies, such as SAP 2012, Design Builder, and ISVE. So here we were looking more at the technologies associated to the methodologies, which can help, usually in a qualitative and quantitative way, whether a building is performing to a certain standard when it comes to overheating risk. What we found as an output was that they are all quite complex, apart from maybe certain tools such as the SAP 2012, which gives you a high risk, medium risk, or low risk output for a building, and the Good Homes Alliance overheating tool, which was a particular tool that we liked because the input mechanism was more akin to a survey rather than a dynamic tool, which may be quite complicated and complex and expensive to introduce across the UK as mandatory. Okay, so this is this is the fun bit. We actually then put together some ideas. We've got 4 here that we've come up with, and we haven't gone into a huge amount of detail as to exactly how they could look, because that's probably the next step of this exercise, where we look to try and do more research on it. But we came up with 4 areas that we could look at, or approaches, for producing a certificate or metric or index for buildings to indicate how well they perform from a climate perspective. This was the certificate approach. I guess this is business as usual. Next to the EPC, or on the EPC, maybe we could have the climate performance that sits next to it. The beauty of this is that it combines what is already being done with regards to the analysis of a building. You're already developing a model or a thermal model or an energy model anyway. So as an output from energy performance certificate, it's not too challenging for the software tools to create a certificate that balances both energy performance and climate performance on the certificate. The risk with this is that often you have people that deliver an EPC and nothing much happens with it. So for this to be quite effective, there also probably needs to be some form of policy change that is similar to what's happening in the industry at the moment, where landlords are required to meet a B rating by a certain period of time. That maybe that could be the same with the climate performance, where you need to meet a certain standard. Maybe that's a rating of A to G, similar to the EPC. Maybe we need to reach C for all buildings moving forward. To kind of go a little bit too far one side, an extreme, a version of a index or certificate that sits within the building could look very, very detailed, and we looked at what that might look like. This kind of metric, which addresses exactly which rooms within a building might be performing poorly. It demonstrates what the score ratings are and demonstrates things in different formats, graphs and tables. Would be very, very useful probably for someone who has got a scientific brain or is incredibly interested in the building itself, but might be quite challenging for the majority of the population who might struggle to understand exactly what is being presented here. So For us, this was a more extreme version, looking at a data approach. Next row. The opposite end of that, and thinking about the food hygiene rating certificate that we discussed earlier, is a lot more simplified version of what we've shown so far. It answers two direct questions. How well is your building shaded from direct sun? And how easily can your building be cooled down? So we call it the sun score and the ventilation performance. This hopefully gives a much simpler approach to the whole issue around, can you show and demonstrate whether a building is performing well from an overheating perspective. However, we wonder whether this is overly simplified, but something like this could benefit from maybe clicking a link to a website that shows you more information about that building. Next one, sure. And finally, something that is actually quite similar to what you might see in a tower block where you have a fire exit strategy, fire plan, exit plan, is actually having something that sits in your building, a certificate that shows which rooms are performing well, which rooms are underperforming from an overheating perspective. Something like this isn't as far-fetched as maybe we first think, because the way that AI is working and the way that estate agents and people and surveyors of buildings are becoming a lot more skilled in putting together floor plans. Maybe this could be combined with non-skilled workers who aren't necessarily overheating experts by trade, but they could marry up the time associated to a survey for carrying out a building survey, whether that's for selling a property or whether that's because it's just has structural issues. Maybe at the same time they can answer further questions within the same assessment and churn out a assessment like this we're seeing here. I think the benefits are that it's a lot visual. There's not as much wording. There's not too much data that can be quite overwhelming. Again, it might be a little bit oversimplified and not necessarily give you the information that you need to help support you in understanding what you can do. But again, that might be something that can be changed by having something to find online, or maybe additional information underneath which sets out the recommendations of what to do. So these are the 4 key approaches that we looked at. There are, of course, many, many more, and ones in between that we could potentially look at for future research and development. And maybe there's a combination of 1 or 2 that would help support things. I think the general thought process was that the industry at the moment just doesn't have anything fit for purpose, and there needs to be a lot more work and research done into understanding and getting some insight from populations through market research to understand how people would view the current EPC rating as it currently is versus what that could look like if we introduced a new certificate around overheating mitigation.
Thank you, Andy. That was really great. I'm going to pass it over to Anna now, who will talk about next steps for this project.
Great, thank you so much, Shreya, and thank you for those really inspiring and informative presentations. We felt it was really important today to just pause for a moment and just from, certainly from Grantham's perspective, just reaffirm our commitment to an ongoing collaboration with Shade the UK, but with the wider community of stakeholders who have a real passion and concern for addressing the risk of overheating in the UK and beyond. Through at Grantham, we have a range of new projects focused on addressing heat risk that will come on board early next year. We'll be looking forward to sharing details of those in due course, but we very much hope to continue working with Shade the UK and others on developing the next steps with this project and seeing this concept of heat metric actually come to life. We feel really proud of the progress that this project has made in this space of needing to really understand what heat risk means and how it could be addressed in buildings. I think the work that Love Design Studio and Shade the UK team has done with a modest budget has been really, really impressive, really detailed and impactful. So we look forward to hearing what everyone on this webinar thinks when they've had a look at the report. Please do share your feedback with us and with the Shade the UK team, and your advice and views on how this whole agenda can be addressed and can be progressed most effectively. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Really a big thank you from us, and if any of the other panelists want to comment on other next steps as well, then please do chip in. If not, over to you, Shreya.
Thank you, Anna. I was just going to say, as Anna said, our report is open for public consultation. So it is available on the Shade UK website. If you go to work and then under building heat resilient neighbourhoods, which is the title of the report, you'll find the full detailed report of everything that was summarised in today's webinar. And any feedback that people have about the report, we'd love to hear it. So you can email your feedback to info@shadetheuk.co.uk. So thank you. That brings us to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. I'm going to dive into the Q&A chat. I see loads of questions have been posted. So thank you all. I'm going to start with the earliest questions. I'll say the question and then anyone from the panel can chip in and answer if they feel that they can. One from Tom Greenhill, who is the founder of the heatwavetoolkit.com, which is a great website, by the way. We've got a question about for Tony. Do you know which design summer year best reflects that big 2022 heat wave, and is the DSY 2020 hot enough?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. It's a really good question. And so the 2020 weather files are not representative of the heat wave that we saw in 2022. They're much cooler in terms of their peak. I think you're looking at, say, the DSY2 2050 50th percentile for the London Heathrow weather location as being more representative of that week-long period with temperatures in the high 30s and touching that 40 degrees C.
Great, thank you. So we've got one from Carl from the Climate and Health Lead at Resilient Cities Network. Another kind of technical question, at what temperature does cross ventilation no longer provide cooling, or is it negligible? And is there a temperature where cross ventilation contributes to internal heating instead?
Yeah, I'll start with this. Andy might jump in. Yeah, it's a big challenge. I think first of all, the focus should be on minimizing those heat gains through better external shading and reducing the internal heat gains. But relying on natural ventilation does have its limitations. So if we're looking at that 26 degrees C and we're looking at the operative temperature rather than just the air temperature, I think you could still have a benefit from cross ventilation up to, say, a 30 degrees C external temperature, dry bulb temperature. But I think beyond that, it then does get difficult for the to remove sufficient internal gains to result in a comfortable temperature.
And do you have your hand up?
Yeah, completely agree with Tony. I think just to add to that is, I think this question highlights the nuance of every single building is completely different. Whereas with EPCs, it's largely about, well, your electricity or gas or oil that you use. That's just three variables to think about. Obviously, there's other things and elements to consider, but with overheating, it's dependent on occupant control. One building that you think is similar to another might be completely different because their window might not be able to open because it's ground floor flat next to a railway track, or there's security issues. So this comes back to the heat metric, which is how do we demonstrate something that's useful to the building owner or landlord, versus making sure that it's not too complex as a output or exercise to take. But going back to the also economic benefits of providing this assessment across the UK is that we feel that we touch on it a little bit more later, but it could create a better industry or a new industry or increase workload for people that ultimately has economic benefit for the homeowner as well. So we think there's a real economic benefit for introducing this piece of work.
Thanks, Andy. We've got a question from Gautier from the Green Londoner. This is a question that either Love Science Studio Shade UK or Grantham could answer. But they had a question that the LCRR recommended that London adopt a heat strategy. Are we seeing any progress with an overall heat strategy for London? Candice.
Yeah, thanks, Shreya. I'm happy to answer that in part. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of the GLA, but we are aware that their plans to develop and adopt a heat strategy are ongoing. There've been a few delays, but it is still very much on the cards. I don't think they know much in terms of the time frame for this, but it's very much something which came out of the London Climate Resilience Review, and it's really been seen as a priority. So we're working with them quite closely on some of the plans that they're putting forwards, and we're hoping that in the next few months they'll be able to share more about what they're thinking on this.
Great, thank you, Candice. There was a second part to the question that says, will there be a follow-up to the release of the final report? So the report is live and on our website, available to read. And as we're opening it up for consultation, we're open for people to read it and provide their feedback. And then this will be open for a few months. And then once, any kind of key feedback and considerations are resolved within the report, then we can have a final launch of the report, I guess around spring next year. So thank you. The next question is for me. It says, did you pick up any insight into feelings of trust between the community and public bodies, i.e. did they feel that public authorities and social housing providers are doing enough and trusted to act both in preparation and adaptation, but also in response? Really good question, so thank you, Carl. I found, especially with a lot of the people that we spoke to, the Islington residents, we spoke to people who live in council housing, and we did find that there was a lot of distrust and not a lot of faith in their local council to be able to address their concerns, both within keeping warm in the winter but also keeping cool in the summer, and so there generally wasn't a very positive kind of outlook, and they didn't feel that if they are experiencing overheating issues in their homes, they didn't really know who to go to. They didn't know how to resolve the issues within their own homes. So yeah, I think that is kind of a real key issue that kind of needs to be resolved, especially working with local authorities to kind of hear the residences and their concerns, not just in winter but also in the summer, and how to respond with that accordingly. So it's a real key problem, especially within social housing, both for the local authorities but also housing associations as well. Candice, you had a hand up. I don't know if that was for the previous question or if you had something to add.
Yeah, if it's okay, just to add to that, I mean, it just sort of reiterates the importance of the work that you've done on narratives and collecting those experiences. And I just wanted to add that we've done a bit of work looking at people's perceptions of heat. And just to add to what you've been saying, what we've also found is that when it comes to information around heat risk and heat waves, people tend to trust less national or local governments, and they tend to rely more on weather services like the Met Office and those projections that are made. So there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of where the trust sits within the public.
Thank you, Candice. So next question, again, it's about the technical question about the weather files. David said that it's fascinating to see that temperatures for 2020 that we presented in the report. So they're wondering if we have any specifically for July 2022.
Yeah, I can take this one, Shreya. So the results, the indicative results for the 2020s weather file wouldn't be in line with the temperatures you might have seen during July 2022, because that weather file doesn't have the same high temperatures going up to 40 degrees C. You'd probably be looking at somewhere between the results we presented for the 2020s and the 2080s weather file as to the temperatures that might have been experienced during that July 22 heat wave.
Thank you, Tony. There's a question from Kat saying, do you have any info about practical options to mitigate overheating in existing buildings and the quality of these for different building types? So I'm going to go ahead and answer that. So actually, Shade UK and Love Science Studio did a recent collaboration with the British Red Cross, and we created a overheating adaptation guide for homes. So it's a quite user-friendly guide that presents around 44 measures that people can incorporate within their homes to keep their home cool in the summer. And so this is kind of, it was quite a comprehensive guide that provided solutions whether you rent a home or you own a home, so they can be like temporary solutions or quite permanent solutions. And so, yeah, that's available on our website. And I think it's just, yeah, quite a user-friendly guide and it's quite a visual guide to kind of help, people cool down in the summer. But if anyone else in the chat has any other kind of information about where people can go to for overheating adaptation guidance, then feel free to say, but yeah, feel free to check that out on our website. Okay, next question. Also, just bearing in mind, we'll go try and answer questions we have up until 1:15. So we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. But if there are any remaining questions that we're not able to answer, then feel free to like email us and we can answer them there. Okay. Next question is from Stephen. Question, will you be investigating a neighbourhood or community scale in this work? Building typologies are important, of course, but internal temps are impacted by their setting, e.g. nearby street trees. So Andy, would you like to answer that?
Thank you, Shreya, if you don't mind. No, we'd love to look at a lot of different variations and scenarios because we're looking at a heat metric or certificate that can be used for pretty much every building type, REBA use class, building class, which means that we'd have to look at flats that have communal heating, where you get overheating in corridors and through riser spaces from floor to floor. We'd want to look at, obviously, not just buildings that house people from vulnerability groups, but also every single building, because you never know with a building or anyone, they might have underlying health issues and be impacted. So it's not just something that we need to concentrate on in one particular area. I think from a neighborhood perspective, again, I think that needs to be considered as part of a larger research piece. I'd say this is a pilot project. It needs a lot more funding to take this forward and demonstrate a lot more rigor and have a lot more backing from a quantitative perspective. But that will take some time and probably some buy-in from local government and government level.
Great, thank you. Great. So we have another question from Paul, which is another technical question. It says, have you considered the use of monitored data to predict overheating risk rather than using modelling, which has known uncertainties regarding overheating prediction? I think either Tony or Andy can take this one. Andy?
Yeah, happy to. In our work, we did touch upon a way to look at this is actually measured data, and it's commented on that. Of course, that would be great. That would be perfect if you could do either real-time data to understand over the previous year how a building has performed and compare that to the actual weather. That would be incredibly useful. Again, we weighed up the pros and cons of that around having to have sensors for every building has its challenges, but also reflect on the fact that having real-time data is probably the best way to actually capture information.
Thank you, Andy. We have another question from Sarah. They said, would you recommend it to be like a heat metric to be adopted in policy for existing dwellings? And would this solely be based on thermal simulation modelling? So I guess that's a two-part question here. First, it's more about, whether this kind of overheating metric would be adopted in policy. Would that be our preference? Andy?
Yes.
Great. And I think Andy's previous answer kind of answered the question about whether it be through thermal simulation modeling, and the ideas that were presented at the end of the presentation about if we could go through a certification approach or a very simple approach or a very data-led approach, I think is definitely down to further research on whether it'd be solely based on thermal simulation modeling, or if it'd be monitoring, or if it just be kind of just assessing the building itself. I think, definitely requires further research on just refining how the building metric would be, and the results would be created in that sense. But thank you for your question. Let's see. Another question from Carl said, could there be an approach that creates an index that collates a number of different climate resilience risks? So in terms of overheating, but also flooding and cold weather as well.
Yeah, and I think that's directed to me. I mean, the simple answer again is yes. I think anything where you want to make drastic change from my perspective is that you need to show someone who's buying something with a large amount of money, which is a home or a building, that it's underperforming, and that has quite a large sway on whether a homeowner or landlord will do something about it, because it influences money. So if we could demonstrate, whether that's a separate certificate or anything like that, we didn't think about it in this one because we had to be quite direct, think about overheating specifically as part of this research. But if you could demonstrate that this building in 50 years it currently doesn't have the right facilities to stop it from being flooded, and in 50 years it might flood, and that's probably a useful bit of information for the homeowner. And I know that Anna and Candice have done a lot of work with regards to working with insurers, and that probably has quite a sway on their thinking around climate adaptation in buildings as well, and what they would want to insure against. So in simple answer is, it would be great if we could include all the different environmental concerns. That could also include air quality. Actually telling someone that this building doesn't perform well or it performs really well from an air quality perspective is probably quite useful information.
Candy. The next question is for Candy specifically. Tom says, are you aware of any studies which seek to predict the number of UK deaths against different severity and lengths of heat waves?
Thanks, Shreya. Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a really good question. I'm not personally aware of these studies, but it doesn't mean they're not actually happening. There are, we do get projections of the number of deaths that can happen under different heatwave scenarios. I wouldn't be able to really speak to the data that's being used, whether it be in terms of health-related data or temperature-related data. But yes, just because I don't know specific studies, I would expect these types of research projects are ongoing.
Great, thank you, Candice. There's a question from Sandy that says, do you think part of the issue with the wider UK's public awareness of the dangers regarding extreme heat events is that they are less visible than, for example, very obvious extreme weather events like flooding, such as Stormbird from last week? I can partly answer this question. Yeah, definitely there's a lack of awareness of the risks regarding overheating and heat waves in the UK. There's definitely a narrative that, you know, hot weather is good and, you know, you can go to the beach and enjoy like a lovely time, but you know there is a lack of awareness of the actual impacts, especially on everyday people, but especially on vulnerable people as well. So I definitely think that plays a part, and something that we're trying to like increase the awareness of at Shade the UK. And also, I think from speaking to Islington residents as well, it's funny because we did the interviews back in March when it was still quite cold, and we did find that, you know, overheating is just such a seasonal issue for people, and people do tend to have short-term memory when it comes to actually how hot it becomes in the summer. So many people, even though they, you know, they were extremely impacted by hot weather in the summer, they kind of then forget about it until the next summer. And then that also kind of creates a cycle of people being unprepared for hot weather, because it becomes cold very quickly, people then are focused on the cold and keeping warm in the winter. We've got a few hands up to answer that question. So I think, Candice, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shreya. And just to, it's a great question. Just to add a couple of points to that, I mean, we are a country where we've not experienced these types of events historically. When they do occur, we have short memories, like you've just said, Shreya. So even towards the end of the summer, or even very quickly after heatwave periods, people tend to forget the severity of the event, particularly if they weren't significantly affected. So we have that particular issue. We also have the issue where culturally we tend to be drawn to the heat. We go on holiday in Europe, and so there's less of awareness of the extent to which, as an individual, you might be vulnerable. And we, in the research that I mentioned earlier on public perceptions, what's come out, which has been really interesting and really concerning, actually, is that when we looked at a particular vulnerable group, so people are over the age of 65 who we know tend to be more vulnerable to heat because of the way in which their body reacts and responds to the heat. What we found is actually that age group tends not to self-identify as vulnerable. And that becomes a real problem because it means they're less likely to think then that messaging or behavior changes would be applicable to them. So there's a real need there to do some work around trying to help people understand how heat affects them personally during the heat, and what are some of the measures that they can put in place before a heat event occurs, so that they're not their health isn't affected negatively.
Thank you, Candice. Anna, you also have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Shreya. I just wanted to comment more generally about an aspect of this project that I think is really valuable, is about combining the local knowledge and lived experience with the kind of like data and analytics side. And that's something that in the UK and globally, often we view the challenge of adapting to climate change as a technical problem that needs to be fixed. So we can engineer stuff and try and solve different risks, and that you see that in the way that finance flows, where there's limited finance for adaptation, it tends to go in like big ticket infrastructure projects to try and solve like heat risk there, or build a wall higher in another place. But actually, the real change when it comes to enabling society to adapt to climate change also needs to include like widening the conversation and hearing a much wider range of views and lived experience, and involving people and communities in thinking about actually how do we address climate risk alongside the wider priorities that we need to see improved in our community. And I think it's really important that we bring in the lived experience of those who are most impacted by climate change, but we also have to consider like procedural, the sort of justice elements as well, around actually who is responsible and held account for action, and how do we balance the need to hear from those who are most impacted without placing an additional burden where there aren't immediate opportunities to actually resolve risks. So I know we've got quite a few like students and PhD, behavioural, with interest in behaviours online. So I just wanted to flag a couple of points about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Andy, you also have your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, be brief, but I think it's a really important question. And there was a bit of an aha moment with Shade UK where we realised that we need to put a face behind this, because people aren't necessarily attracted to statistics around deaths, and people aren't emotively connected to numbers, they're emotively connected to human stories. And that's how we're going to affect change. And it's another aha moment was why it's, I think when we think about overheating traditionally in the UK, we always think about the good things, but when I think we struggle to put the different nuances and different variables together in our heads, we think, oh, people died from overheating, that's because they were in the sun. It's not necessarily that. It might be because the air conditioning failed, or the door wasn't, or the window couldn't open properly. It hasn't been fixed for 2 years, and they've been complaining at the social housing. Yeah, the drugs cabinet failed, or someone went to buy some food and the shops closed down because it was the air conditioning had failed, and things like that. It's so complex, but the combination of all these effects need to be considered when we're creating adaptation measures, and of course against flood risk and other environmental risks as well.
Thanks, Andy. We're nearing 1:15, so I think we just have time for one more question and then we'll end it there. There's a question from Marcus from Inkling, again, another technical question, but he asks, when assessing risk in the modelling, was there a reason why a fixed threshold of 26 degrees was chosen rather than the adaptive approach with an acceptable temperature range, which is used in SIBSE Team 59 and Team 52?
Yeah, thanks, Shreya. Yeah, I think it's a pretty reasonable question. So we've just used, for I think for simplicity of presenting some clearer results in the overview presentation here, used that 26 degrees C limit, which is applied for when you're looking at the predominantly naturally ventilated residential dwellings for the bedrooms, and then for the habitable rooms for predominantly mechanically ventilated buildings. But for sure, it's a bit more nuanced than just looking at that single temperature. There is a bit of the adaptive temperature depending on the external temperature as well.
Great, thank you, Tony. I think we're going to have to conclude there, but if there are any questions that we didn't answer, because there are quite a few more in the chat still, please feel free to email us or get in contact with us to learn more, or have your any questions answered. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to today's webinar and taking the time to join us today, and for your fantastic engagement as well with the Q&A. We really appreciate your attention and your questions. Again, the report is available to read on Shade UK's website, and any feedback can be sent to info@shadeuk.co.uk. So yeah, thank you all, and thank you to the panelists as well. You were all amazing, and to the audience, have a lovely rest of your day.